Good morning. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very grateful to Amit and IIM Bangalore for inviting me. I was supposed to be here tomorrow at 3:30 to give the closing keynote, but some of you may know that Rekha Menon, who was scheduled to be here this morning, suffered a bereavement. And Amit called me at 8:30 and called in a few favors, asked me to be here. So I hope to measure up somehow to the benchmark that Rekha would have set. I tend to be a somewhat contrarian person. As you can see, I've done very different things in my life, and that has shaped how I think. So I'm going to say things today that would have been contrarian, but Dr. Kang's comments have, I think, very well prepared the ground, so maybe it won't be such a difficult thing after all. So I'll start with, 50 years ago, there was Professor Abraham Zalesnik. Some of you may remember him if you were old enough, if you're like me. But he was at Harvard Business School, and he wrote a very influential article back then. It was called Managers and Leaders, Are They Different? I was very young at that time, learning to be a manager. And this was an extraordinarily influential article because I began to realize, in fact, these are two profoundly different skills, if you will. And one is, as they say, about doing things right. The other is about doing the right things. And both, of course, are important for an organization to be successful. But I've come to, over time, particularly lately, realize that the biggest gap we suffer in our organizations and in our country, in society, is a shortage of the right kind of leaders. And in particular, I think about leaders who are capable of driving transformational change, leaders who have a deep sense of integrity, and leaders who are capable or very committed to creating a better world rather than merely being driven by their own self-interest. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So again, as Dr. Kang said, the world is very much at a tipping point. We're precariously teetering between extraordinary opportunities on one hand and extraordinary challenges on the other. Over the last 3 decades, we've had a rising tide which has created unbelievable prosperity in most parts of the world, or many parts of the world, and great stability. But this tide is now beginning to move out in all the ways that were mentioned earlier. And there are multiple transitions which are happening, which is creating conditions which are called volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA. Now, you can see this everywhere, right? So if you look at business, the combination of rising competitive intensity and technology disruption is creating chaos in industry after industry. You see this happening, of course, in the world of technology. You see this happening in banking, which was for a long time a pretty staid business. You see this happening in retail in a massive way. And just look at the evidence. This morning, Apple was the first company ever to touch $1 trillion. Amazon will probably achieve that in the next few days or weeks. At the same time, 100-year-old GE has been unceremoniously ejected from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and it happened in 1 year. And so we're seeing more and more of this happening. And there was a famous venture capitalist who, 10 years ago said that organizations created in the 20th century are unlikely to survive the 21st. At that point, it seemed like an exaggerated claim, but today I think it's becoming quite common. So that's what's happening in industry. What else is happening? Well, the Western rules-based global order that was created by the US and others after the Second World War, that's beginning to be dismantled. It's crumbling. And strangely, the people who are tearing it down are Donald Trump and China. And of course, that's creating its own chaos. Again, Dr. Kang introduced the idea of wicked problems. What are wicked problems? These are complex problems, systemic issues. You have many, many actors with very divergent interests. And so finding solutions to these is non-trivial, right? And more, humankind is facing wicked problems. right? So what are some of these? Climate change. This morning, The Economist arrived, those of you who subscribe to it. And the cover is, "We're losing the battle against climate change." Okay? We've got environmental degradation, poisoning of our food supply, water stress. You can go on and on and on. This is the nature of problems. Then you have capitalism. Capitalism is, the engine that over the last 200, 250 years has been responsible for much of the prosperity in the world. Yet today, it has mutated into a strain which is the engine of inequality. So if you saw the statistics that came out 2 months ago, last year in India, 73% of the new wealth created was pocketed by the top 1%. Okay? It's a stunning number. So when we look at GDP growth, it is completely misleading because it's all about averages. When you just peel one layer deep, it's a very, very strikingly different situation. And this inequality is only going to get exacerbated with new technology that's going to gobble up all the jobs that she talked about on the left. So, it's not all bleak, right? Equally, the world has never had more technology, more resources, more talent to not only solve every one of these problems, but if those of you who like this Yuval Harari, he talks about our ability to create actually a new superhuman species. All the capability is virtually there. So we can do anything if only we can decide to do it and align people and resources behind them. And that's why it's all about leadership. So whether the world tips towards chaos or actually a much better future, brighter future, depends entirely on us, on the kind of leadership that we have in government, in civil society, and most of all business, because at the end of the day, we live in a capitalist society. But unfortunately, when you look at the caliber of leadership all across, it's not all that great, which is how I set up today's talk. Business schools have, over time, largely become vocational training institutes. We've been churned, and I'm a product of it, as she may have mentioned, I forget. I graduated from Harvard Business School 30 years ago, so I'm very much a product of this system. But for quite a long time, many decades, we've been churning out managers who are analytically good. They're capable of getting things done, running operations, making the trains run on time. But to use a military analogy, most of what we produce are peacetime majors, peacetime colonels. They follow rules, they follow orders, but don't have the capacity to imagine radically new futures. Now, there's this famous quote attributed to Einstein. I have no idea whether he actually said it, but he said that the problems of the world cannot be solved by the same people who created them. So the need of the hour is for what I call wartime generals who can win the wars that really matter, which I talked about. We need generals who can build new enterprises, lead transformational change in existing institutions and companies, and help solve the wicked problems that are confronting humanity. So what do you look for most of all? I think, I've come to now look for three things, three characteristics. I don't believe in long lists of 20 things that we must have, just three things. But there are three difficult things. The first is this capacity to drive transformational change. It's not easy, because most of all it implies the ability to lead by influence without authority. I took on this quite difficult task of helping turn around and transform a public sector bank, Bank of Baroda, 3 years ago. I did it because the governor, Raghuram Rajan, was a friend and he asked me to. And then the appointment letter came. It was some 12 or 13 pages. 11 pages told me what I could not do. Okay? There was nothing that said what you could do. So it was very clear to me that neither the chair nor the board of directors has any power, but yet you're supposed to drive transformation. Good news is we succeeded to a large extent, the numbers show it, etc., so it's possible. But this is becoming more and more a singular quality that we need. If you just depend on formal power and authority, you're not going to be solving those wicked problems because most of the other actors don't really have to listen to you. So what does that take? One of the essential things it takes is the ability to create and communicate a compelling and inclusive mission that makes people want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Transformation leaders define success not in numbers and financial terms and wealth and power, but in terms of ideas that will change the world. I was fortunate to have worked with not one, but two transformational leaders. The first was Bill Gates, and back in 1978, he set out the founding mission for Microsoft. He said to put a computer in every home and on every desktop, at a time when the world probably had 200 computers, mostly behind air-conditioned rooms. The second leader I worked with was Narayan Murthy, and again, back in 1980, he articulated the founding mission of Infosys as to create the first globally respected company out of India. So these are lofty things, and it makes many, many people want to be part of this mission. But of course, it's not enough to just articulate it and move on. You have to have the courage, the tenacity, the willpower to see things through. Now, transformational leadership turns out to be a very, very difficult quality. As usual, I'm losing my notes because I wrote them in the taxi today. But, it is as much about nature as it is about nurture. You have to look for people who have a certain spark. Why do they have that spark? We don't know. But look for it and then blow oxygen and pour fuel on it till it becomes a roaring fire. That's all you can do. So one of the things that we did was quite interesting at Bank of Baroda. So recognizing that the single biggest issue that we had was absence of the right kind of leadership. About 2 years ago, we took a look at 54,000 employees, and we sifted through them, and we identified 2,700 who we thought had leadership ability, which was much better. So 5%, okay? And we look not only at performance track record, but we look at passion, drive, ability to make things happen. Blah. And then this was right from scale 1, which is your probationary officer, all the way to GM, which is scale 7. And we put them through a year or a little longer leadership sort of acceleration program. And we brought in knowledge partners of the kind that you would all be familiar with. Towards the end of the program, we assessed them again. We've done all those things that Amit had: classroom, projects, lectures, individualized assessments, coaching. A year later, we assessed them. About 20% truly had leadership qualities. And they were now, much more aware of it. 20% of 5% is 1%. So 1% of the total population really had leadership qualities. All the others became better followers. Okay, that's all. So these people had leadership to begin with. We were able to strengthen it to a reasonable extent. Okay, so that's all we can do. But that's perhaps a little bit of a clue as to what business schools might want to do when you look at the admissions process. So here, where do we go here? Right. So this idea of finding leaders, making them into transformational leaders is one idea. But it's necessary but not sufficient. The second thing is we have to drill into future leaders a passionate commitment to this new idea that is emerging called conscious capitalism. As I said, capitalism has been the major force creating prosperity around the world over the last 2 centuries. But today we have a strain of capitalism that is highly exploitative. It is exploitative of people, and it's exploitative of the environment. And if we are going to continue to have benefit from the good of capitalism, we need leaders who can take this and mutate it into a better, gentler form. One of the people who I admire greatly is Paul Polman of Unilever. To me, he is the personification of what we need to see in leaders of tomorrow. Okay, not only are they good at running businesses and doing all those things, but they're actually trying to take their company and make it, into a force for good, doing well and doing good. And this requires leaders, all of us, to think very deeply about ethical questions that I guarantee few of you think about. What is an example of this? For example, the trivial question, what do you pay your workers? You have many choices. Mostly, you pay what you can get away with. Okay, you have to look at your own house, the maids, the gardener, the driver, pay what you can get away with. Sometimes there is a legally mandated minimum wage. So you can say, no, I'm going to be compliant with the law, I'll pay minimum wage. Some companies decide attrition is an issue, we must keep attrition low, so we're going to pay market wages, we're going to pay at the 70th or 80th percentile of the market. Almost nobody thinks about the question of what is a living wage? What is a living wage today? What do we need to do to pay people so they can live with dignity, so they can educate their children, so they can also, come out of the cycle, if you will. So we have to get leaders to think about these questions. Again, Professor talked about all the technologies which are shaping the world, which we call the fourth industrial revolution. They're magical. But every technology, right from fire to nuclear power to the internet, has been dual use. You can use it to do good, you can use it to do bad. And that is even more true of all the technologies in the fourth industrial revolution. So you need leaders who actually think hard about how are we going to deploy these technologies. Are we going to use it to augment human capability or to replace it? Should you use a technology just because it's possible to? Or do you actually have to make choices? So for instance, you're aware that Amazon just opened a store where there is no human being. Okay, it's a technology demonstrator. You walk in there, you pick things off the shelf, the camera sees what you pick off, it debits your account, you walk out. It's an extraordinary demonstration of technological capability. But just because you can do it, should you be able to do it? Just because you can have driverless cars and trucks, and let's assume you can even get through the safety issues and the regulatory issue, should a society embrace it? Or do we have to think about these choices? How do you use robots in the factory floor? Do you use it to replace workers? Or do you use it to automate unsafe operations, make lifting and difficult jobs easier? So every one of these technologies represents a conscious choice. Unfortunately, very few CEOs today, even if they are founders of great companies, think about it, which means they're merely acting as managers, not as leaders. So that's my second point. The third point is this: we need leaders with character. Right from Rajat Gupta to Fanish Murthy, we have had leaders who are accomplished people, extraordinary capability, great accomplishments, who have crashed equally spectacularly because they have not been able to manage some weakness of character. And unfortunately, in India, we live in a society, in a country, where there are no legal and even not even reputational consequences for misdemeanors. Okay? What does that do? It results in a sick society and sick corporate cultures where the only thing that matters is hitting your numbers and winning. Now again, how many business school programs actually focus on the issue of character? I remember that ours was the first batch, class of 1992 at Harvard Business School, which introduced ethics. That's because a number of alumni had gone to jail just before that. Okay, so a man called John Shad gave a big grant to Harvard Business School, $100 million to introduce ethics. So we were the first ethics program. But generally, people are uncomfortable talking about these issues, and mostly we don't even believe that by this stage, character and ethics can be taught. If they haven't learned it already, what are we going to do in one class? That's the belief. My own view, my own experience is it is difficult but not impossible. The ancient Greeks, they believed that the whole point of education was to build character and a sound moral compass. It wasn't to give them the skills to go earn a living. It was about building character. Philosophy, they believed, was not something to be studied, but something to be lived. There's something powerful out here which we need to get back to. So, I teach a lot. I don't teach in business schools. I teach in, the companies that I work in. And I sometimes go to Missouri to teach at the academy over there. And when I teach leadership, I get the class to reflect on uncomfortable questions. For instance, in banking, one of my favorite questions is, why should you be honest if honesty doesn't pay? And the first reaction that you get is silence. Okay, it's a very difficult question. But then the class gets animated. You get people to reflect on issues like, why do you exist? What is the legacy you want to leave behind in this job, in your career? What do you want people to say about you when you're retiring? And when you pose these questions, the amount of energy that you unleash is phenomenal. And a year later, they've forgotten about all those things like design thinking and analytics and all that stuff. This is what they remember. This is what they take away. So I think it's possible to do this, but we have to make it an integral part of the curriculum. We've got to stay with it long enough that it actually begins to make a change. So let me sort of begin to wrap up here. You talked about, Professor Kang talked about the people who criticized MBA programs. One of the critics, I think a constructive critics, was Professor Dave Garvin and also Shrikant Datar, who wrote a book called Reimagining the MBA. And they said, listen, these programs are too focused on skilling, on getting people to learn new things like analytics or managing people. And they said, we've got to get them to go beyond that. They need to become managers. We need to teach them how to not just know, but also do. I don't think they went far enough. As I tried to articulate, I think we need to get people to be and to lead. So Garvin talked about knowing and doing. I talk instead about being, leading, and knowing. And that's the shift we have to make. And, I think this is going to require an extraordinarily fundamental rethink of everything. Why business schools exist, success metrics, admissions criteria, and of course, content and pedagogy. The MBA must become an MBL, a Master of Business Leadership. And I think that's frankly the only thing that's going to keep it relevant. Thank you.